conference that I called Preventive Plant Control. And I am the only one presenting today, but my whole dissertation committee did help me both construct the survey and analyze it. So I want to give them a proper shout out real quick. So JD Wolfhorst, my main advisor, is a social scientist, and worked as a soil hydrologist. Alex Moss is an agricultural economist, and then we also have a member of USDA, Dave Huggins, who is a soil scientist. So, just to give you a little bit of background on why we felt this survey was important. In the region where we conducted the survey in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing, on behalf of climate change, real increase in both the frequency and the intensity of extreme precipitation events, particularly in the spring months. And that's really creating a problem for farmers because in the spring, they're obviously trying to plant their crops. And so a lot of these extreme precipitation events are making the fields too wet, they're causing flooding, and just generally preventing farmers from being able to get their crops in the ground and being able to get them to grow. So one option that a lot of them have begun to utilize a bit as they've seen this begin to happen across the region is the USDA Preventive Plant Program. And it has a lot of great benefits. It does provide immediate financial relief for those farmers who haven't been able to plant, but it also has a lot of flip sides because without any conservation requirements in the program, a lot of them are actually moving towards practices that are increasing their erosion risk. And so then that's kind of running counterproductive to a lot of what the USDA is trying to do in general throughout the region to reduce erosion and to increase conservation. So that's kind of creating this interesting kind of nexus between these extreme weather events, trying to manage the risk of all those events and trying to make sure farmers aren't being too negatively impacted, but also trying to do that in a way where soil erosion isn't being increased and soil conservation is still remaining a priority. And we chose to study this in the Pacific Northwest, but it really is kind of a nationwide issue. So this kind of interesting balance between these three aspects is really kind of a widespread issue. And I'll get into all that a little bit more in a second, but just to give you a little overview of the Preventive Plant Program because it's not very well known. It is a USDA program. Its main goal is just to provide financial assistance to those farmers who weren't able to plant their crops in a timely manner. And it does this by giving them a direct payment for the estimated amount of their input costs. So things that they presumably already bought before they knew that they wouldn't be able to plant, like seed and synthetic fertilizer and things of that nature. And it is housed under the USDA, as I mentioned. It's funded through the Risk Management Agency, which is part of the USDA. It's actually administered by private insurance agents. So they're the ones that are out in the fields validating that, yes, the soil is too dry or too wet, you're not going to be able to plant in it, so we can move forward with the claim. And they're also the ones making sure that these producers are meeting some of the limited restrictions within the program, such as it is required to show that for the acreage you try to claim, that for 3 of the past 4 years it has been both insured and successfully harvested. So we're making sure that all those things are in place, and there is limited options for conservation within the program. But really the only one is to plant cover crops, and all of those costs fall on the producer. They're not covered by the program at all. So obviously a lot of these producers that just experience a significant financial loss are not going to opt to take more cost to plant a cover crop, and they're just going to go for typically the easiest, most cost-effective strategy, which is just to leave the land idle or fallow. And that's what is causing that increased risk for erosion. And to give you just further background in kind of the region that we're operating in, we actually conducted the survey in a sub-region of the Pacific Northwest, known as the Palouse region, which you can see in the bottom right there. It basically is the intersection of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, so it spans across all 3 states. And this area that we're located in has a really severe history of erosion. You can see in the top right there, the circled little figure there is actually a person standing in a very deep, real erosion area. And that is in a fallow field following an extreme precipitation event. And throughout a lot of the first half of the 20th century, we really were experiencing this really intense erosion. A lot of times we were seeing 70 or 100 tons per acre of soil erosion. So it was a really bad place. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, the USDA and NRCS really started a lot of conservation programs, really started spreading conservation practices and helping the producers just understand the general risk we face in this region with our unique soils. But now, a lot of the people that were part of that transition, a lot of people that saw those extreme erosion events are no longer farming. So now when they're experiencing this extreme precipitation and they're trying to get the insurance claims, they're just taking the easiest route after that claim. They're leaving it idle, they're leaving it fallow without necessarily understanding the risk for erosion that they're putting on themselves. So that's why we really thought it was important to develop a survey to see both producers in the Pacific Northwest and in the Palouse specifically, what is their perspective of the preventive plant program? What do they think its goals are, and what are they hoping to get out of it? As well as those producers who chose to implement conservation practices as a risk management tool, what were they hoping to get out of it, and what was their motivation for entering a conservation practice? So we developed a survey. It was 4 pages, 17 questions in total, and we sent it out to a little over 1,000 households across the Palouse region, to all of these 8 counties. And these 8 counties were chosen because we analyzed the utilization rate of the preventive plant program in every county in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And these 8 counties had the 8 highest rates of utilization of the program. So that's why we focused in on this one little cluster. And when we identified that cluster, we then went to an agricultural data company some of you might be aware of called DTN. And that's where we got the mailing list to send out this survey. And we wanted the mail survey, but we also included a short URL link along with every survey so that they could fill out the survey online if they wished to. They didn't wish to, but they could, so that's good. And we also included an incentive package. So for every respondent, they were entered either a drawing for either a $500, $750, or $1,000 gift card to Cabela's. And those different rates were determined by different levels of participation. So for example, the few that did fill out a survey online and also signing up for a follow-up interview were ways to get pushed up into the higher categories of the gift card drawings. And obviously those are fairly high incentives, so I think that helped our response rate a lot. So we did have a 36% response rate, which we were very pleased with, and that left us with a total of 339 survey responses that we were able to analyze. And from all of that, we found that not only were we pleased with the response rate overall, but we were also really pleased to see what a large percentage of the respondents actually had submitted a preventive plant claim and were familiar with the program. That kind of validated our study area and let us know that we were going to get a lot of useful data from this. And one of the first things we noticed was that for those who had participated in the preventive plant program, they had submitted an average of 9 claims over the past 20 years. So essentially, they had a prevented plant every other year that they were trying to account for. So that really showed kind of the increasing effect of these extreme precipitation events and the detrimental effects that they're having on agricultural producers in our region. And along with that, we also kind of confirmed our suspicion that there really isn't a lot of conservation happening in this program. 83% of those who said that they had submitted the claim reported that, after they submitted the claim, they just left the field fallow and idle for the following year and increased that erosion potential. And so then we got to be able to see kind of their perceived impacts, what they thought was happening after they utilized the program. And 52% of the respondents saw a decrease in weed presence, which obviously makes sense with the fallow. And there are a lot of benefits to that, obviously, but that also is reducing the root structure, and it's removing the root structure completely and increasing that erosion risk, which, again, a lot of them were not aware of, but that's a huge risk in our region. And so ultimately 26% said that they, after filing for a plant claim and fallowing the field, they experienced increased erosion, and 14% said that they just saw decreased soil health overall. So that was really interesting to see what they ended up experiencing after being involved in the program, and it was largely detrimental. So we also were able to look at their motivations for getting preventive plant claim and what they were expecting to get out of the program. So by and large, people were hoping to reduce their financial losses, they were hoping to reduce risk, and also reduce impacts on soil and water quality. So that was really interesting to kind of see that contradiction of what they were expecting and what ended up really happening to them. And overall, what we did was ask them, what motivated you to take out this preventive plant claim? What were you hoping to get out of it? And we had them answer for a wide variety of factors on a 4-point Likert scale. This had a number 1 low to number 4 high impact on your decision to ultimately file a preventive plant claim. And overall, what we found was that financial and environmental factors were the largest things driving these decisions. And that was great to understand for preventive what they ultimately were hoping to get out of the program. But we also wanted to look at people who chose to implement those conservation practices as their risk management tool. What motivated them to get into conservation, and what can we do to show other producers that, hey, these are the things that you can get out of it, and this is the benefits you can expect to see. So one of the largest things we saw was people really wanted to try to preserve their land for future generations. Anyone who's worked in agriculture probably know that there's this very large link between the farm and the family, and they really want to keep those two things integrated. So that was a really large motivating factor for people getting into conservation. They also wanted to help improve their soil and water quality, increase their revenue, and also just try to reduce chemicals in the environment. So that was some of their key motivations for getting into conservation, and some of the things that we think we can focus on in the future to try to get other producers to be involved in conservation as well. And interestingly, within conservation, environmental and financial factors were still the significant figures driving these decisions, but they were flipped. And so in preventive plant, the financial factors were mostly driving the decisions, whereas in conservation, the environmental factors were the most significant source of motivation for them. So through all of that, we were able to identify two key ways of increasing soil conservation within our region. And the first one is the very tried and true method that's obviously been going on for decades, which is just directly incentivizing conservation. So we asked respondents, what would make you more motivated to implement conservation practices? What can we give to you that would make you want to do this? And some of the largest things that we saw from them were they wanted financial assistance for those implementation costs, things like transitioning to no-till and reduced-till, lots of expensive equipment involved in that. So they wanted some financial help for those initial costs, increased insurance protections, scaled direct payments based on their level of participation. They were saying, maybe I can't go all the way to no-till the first year, but if I can implement a few practices, maybe I could still get a little financial help. And then also utility discounts for things like electricity and water usage, which obviously those prices are increasing a lot for agricultural producers at this moment. So that was the first pathway we identified. And then we also identified a second pathway of altering this preventive plant program that's really becoming prevalent throughout the region, and maybe adding some conservation into it, because one of the questions in the survey was, well, if it became required to implement some conservation practices to receive this funding, would you still be interested in it? And by and large, 70% of respondents said, oh yeah, we'd definitely still be interested. We really think this is a valuable program, and we really would still be interested in it even if it required conservation. So that was a great thing to see, and we wondered, all right, well, if we're going to add our own requirements, what are things that you're hoping to see change in the preventive plant program that would further motivate you to buy into it? So some of the largest things I wanted to see were some premium protections, making sure that, particularly as we're moving in and trying to get them to reduce their amount of claims through implementing conservation, in those dwindling times when they still do need to submit a claim, they just want to make sure that their premiums aren't going to go through the roof the next year. Higher coverage rates overall, less restrictions on that acreage that they claim for payments. And then also scaled payments based on commodity prices, because one of the largest critiques of the program is that they're just simply kind of estimating through a series of vague calculations how much to give you based on your estimated input costs. So they want a little bit more direct correlation to how much they were getting based on the crops that they would have been selling if they were able to plant it. So overall, some of our critical findings were that very interesting contradiction between what producers were actually perceiving the goals of the preventive plant program to be and what was motivating them to get into it, and then what they're actually experiencing on the back end. Because in general, they were really felt that the program was a way to reduce their financial risk, reduce the risk of degradation to their land, and reduce their risk overall. And in many cases, what we saw from their own observations was that, well, actually it's in many cases increasing erosion, that's increasing those financial losses, and then that's increasing their risk for future issues. So that was a really interesting contribution to see. But it was also great to see that within those producers that are having these issues, 60% of them say that they're really interested in learning more about conservation, they're really excited about it. So we thought that really presented a unique opportunity to take this preventive plant program that's really gaining prevalence throughout the region and try to add in some conservation measures, conservation requirements, or at least integrate it with just some of the other USDA programs, such as equipment that already exist and that are already incentivizing people to use conservation. Because if we can kind of interlink those two systems, then that gives us a chance to increase soil conservation throughout our whole region in a way that's not gonna alienate producers because they're excited about the program and they're excited about conservation. So marrying those two things gives us an opportunity to increase soil erosion in a way that everyone can be on board with. So that's actually what the rest of my dissertation is looking at, is just from an environmental and an economic perspective, showing the viability of interweaving conservation into this preventive plant program. And that is all I have. Thank you so much.